Hey guys! Tonight we slip into a different kind of story, not one written in books or etched in stone, but one whispered in courtyards under the hush of stars, plucked from the strings of a kora, and held in memory for centuries. You walk a long dirt road in the quiet part of evening, the air thick with the scent of roasted millet and distant firewood, the sky wide and warm and humming with the soft rhythm of crickets. You hear it before you see it, the slow, deliberate beat of a drum, measured like a heartbeat after a long day, steady as footsteps on worn soil. Somewhere nearby, a voice rises, not sharp, not loud, but full, shaped by practice and purpose. The sound curls like smoke, rising into the dusk. It is the voice of a griot. And tonight, they are calling the names. Not just a few names. Not just kings or warriors. All the names. The names of fathers and mothers and their fathers and mothers before them. Whole lines of ancestry stacked like clay bricks rising toward the moon. The griot does not pause. They do not stammer. They do not ask for a script. Because the script is inside them. And you, dear listener, are about to learn how that memory was made. Or rather, how it was inherited, practiced, performed, protected. But first, a reality check. You're going to hear about people who could recite hundreds of names and family histories from memory with precision, under pressure, for hours, while maintaining melody and rhyme. You probably forgot what you came into the kitchen for this morning. That's okay. You're among friends. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop your location and your local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk now into the heart of a village in what is today Mali, though the lines were different back then, the names heavier with breath and dust. The fire crackles low at the center. You take your place among others, some with backs straight and hands folded, others half dozing, already surrendering to the warmth of a slow tale. The griot sits with legs crossed, fingers grazing the strings of a harp lute that glows gold in the firelight. Their voice begins, not in a shout, but with a hush that demands attention. Listen, and I will tell you of the fathers. And the fathers of those fathers. And the ones who lived when the earth was soft and the names were still being born. The names come slowly at first. Sagalan, Niani, Jabate, Kuyate, Traore, each one planted like a seed. And then more come, winding like vines. A cousin who led a caravan south, an uncle who wrestled lions, a mother who kept the rains at bay by singing into her well. Each story is wrapped around a name. Each name anchors the lineage. And this is where you begin to understand. You are not listening to a story. You are listening to a library. Here's your first grounded historical fact. The Griots, also known as Gili or Jali in various West African languages, were trained oral historians, musicians, praise singers, and keepers of genealogical memory, active across societies like the Mali, Songhai, and later the Fulani and Hausa empires. They were not just entertainers. They were archivists, chroniclers, advisors. And memory? Memory was their trade. But here's your first delightful fringe detail. Some griots claimed they could recite lineages, longer than the Bible. Not in pages, of course, but in hours. A griot in the 20th century famously rattled off 130 generations of a single family tree without pausing once. That's longer than Genesis to Revelation, with footnotes, by the way. And they didn't do it sitting quietly in a corner with flashcards. No, they did it aloud. With rhythm, with pitch, with music weaving under their breath like an old friend keeping time. You glance around the fire and watch how the listeners move, they nod. They hum. They sometimes repeat back the last name spoken, like a soft chorus. This isn't passive listening. This is a call and a remembering. And here's where the scholarly debate stirs. Were these griots, living books, tasked only with preservation, or did they have creative license, adjusting, embellishing, even omitting based on mood or audience? Some say griots were strict keepers of historical fact, trained to memorize and repeat with no deviation. Others argue they were like jazz musicians. The notes were known, but how they got from one to the next was an art form, fluid and responsive. The truth is probably both. Rigid structure, flexible delivery. You lean in. The griot speaks of the first blacksmith, whose hammer rang louder than thunder, and of the twins who tamed a river by naming every fish in it. The stories don't just preserve memory. They protect identity. To forget your ancestors is to lose your place in the story. And in griot societies, no one is born outside the story. Children grow up hearing these tales, absorbing them like warm rain. They're sung into language, lulled into lineage. And then, one day, a child is chosen, not by merit, not always by family, but sometimes by dream or omen. And the training begins. But we'll get to that in the next part. For now, the fire flickers. The names stretch on. You hear rhythms inside rhythms, meaning inside sound. You realize you haven't moved in half an hour. You didn't need to. The griot did the walking for you. Back through time, across deserts and trade roads, into homes lost to memory but not to name. You smile, eyes heavy. Because tonight, you've met someone who remembers. And that's enough for now. You're still sitting by the fire, only now it's burned lower, just a shimmer of amber embers beneath the ash. A soft glow licking the underside of a kettle no one's bothered to refill. Around you, the village has gone quiet. Someone has fallen asleep beside a log. Someone else hums softly, out of tune, but content. And still, the griot speaks. Not urgently, not loudly, just steadily, like the voice of water through reeds. And slowly, you begin to wonder, not just what they remember, but who they are. Not the performer, not the music, but the griot themselves. Because let's be honest, storyteller doesn't quite cover it. Historian feels clinical. Poet comes close. Walking Wikipedia with rhythm and soul. Maybe. But still, it's more than that. Here's your grounded historical fact. The griot was a deeply embedded figure in West African society, with a lineage as honored, and sometimes as feared, as that of royalty. Their role was hereditary in many cultures. You weren't just trained into it. You were born into it. A griot family was a griot family. Their last name could reveal everything about their function. The Jabate, the Kuyate, the Jobarda. Names that carried the weight of centuries. Names that, if you heard them at a gathering, told you someone nearby could probably recall your grandfather's fishing route and recite the praise name of a horse your uncle once owned. They weren't just walking archives. They were instruments of accountability. They sang truth, whether it made you beam with pride or squirm a little in your sandals. Griots remembered your victories, but also your debts. Your origins, but also your missteps. You might pay a griot to praise your father at a wedding. But you wouldn't dare bribe them to forget the year he lost a battle or married poorly. That memory was inherited, and like any good inheritance, it was stubborn. And here's your fringe tidbit. Griots sometimes accompanied nobles on military campaigns, not to fight, but to observe, to record, to remember. Imagine that. You're riding into battle, spear in hand, adrenaline in your throat, and somewhere behind you is a man with a drum, watching you closely. Not to save you, not to cheer, just to memorize what happens. And eventually, to sing about it in great detail, with very few edits. But this wasn't just a performance gig. This was a relationship. A griot might be attached to a single family or clan, following them through generations. They didn't just pop in when something important happened. They were there all the time. At births, deaths, weddings, disputes, harvests, illnesses, hunts, festivals. They sat in the corner of the room, listening. Always listening. The griot knew when to speak and when to wait. And when they did speak, oh, you listened. Because griots didn't talk for their own amusement. They talked to place you. To fix you inside a longer thread. A web of names and stories that said, this is who you are. This is where you come from. This is what your people endured so you could stand here today. And if that sounds a little intimidating, yeah, it was. Which brings us to tonight's scholarly question. Was the griot primarily a servant of their patron family, or did they hold independent social power? Some historians argue that griots, because of their dependence on patronage, operated at the whims of the elite, basically hired bards. Others push back, insisting that the content griots preserved gave them leverage. If you are the only person who knows the king's grandfather's sacred name, you hold the king's identity in your mouth. That's not just memory, that's influence. You imagine it now. A dispute breaks out in a village. Two men both claiming to be descendants of a revered warrior. The griot is summoned. They don't bring paperwork. They bring a drum, and a memory, and a voice that names 10 generations in each direction like it's nothing. The room quiets. The decision is made. No vote, just voice. Sister to the scribe, cousin to the judge. You glance back at the griot across the fire. Their face is unreadable, not distant, just practiced. Griots were taught to feel what they spoke, but not to be owned by those feelings. It was a kind of performance, yes, but not for applause. For continuity. You don't tell a lineage because it's dramatic. You tell it because it must be known. And yet, griots could be funny. There are tales of griots who poked gentle fun at kings during ceremonies, or who told slightly embarrassing stories about noble children, on purpose, as a kind of grounding ritual. Yes, you are royal. But also, you once cried because your cousin stole your plantain. Even memory, in griot hands, could be playful. You begin to realize that being a griot wasn't just about memorizing. It was about presence. The griot was always there. At the edge of things. The voice in the corner. The echo of the past stitched into the fabric of today. And they weren't just tolerated. They were expected. Because if a name is not spoken, it risks disappearing. And griots? Griots made sure no name ever fell into the dust. You write in your journal now, the firelight flickering on the page. The griot was not memory's servant. They were its steward. Their voice was a vessel, their ear a ledger. They watched kings grow old, watched children become parents, watched mistakes ripple forward like dust from a caravan long gone. And still they spoke. You hear one more name carried across the fire. You don't recognize it, but someone does. And they smile. The night deepens now, quiet and slow, like ink spreading through cloth. The last ember has curled into blackness, the air grown cooler, the kind of cool that makes you pull your blanket up to your chin and listen with your whole body. There's no fire now, but the story continues. The griot doesn't need flames to be heard. Their words flicker on their own. You're sitting, now, not just in a village courtyard, but in the echo of centuries. The voice you're listening to tonight has been passed through more mouths than you can imagine. Which is why, before we go any deeper, it's time you understood the architecture of all this remembering. Not buildings, not archives, but something more flexible, more alive. You're entering a library with no walls. Here's your grounded historical fact. In pre-colonial West African societies, where oral tradition held primacy, griots served as mobile repositories of collective memory, functioning like living archives for communities, families, and empires. If there was no written record, and in many areas, there wasn't for centuries, the griot was the book, the index, and the footnote. The griot didn't store knowledge in ink or stone. They stored it in rhythm and story and breath. But here's the part that truly starts to twist your brain around the campfire. Griots could remember thousands of genealogical links, complete with titles, epithets, deeds, rivalries, births, deaths, marriages, migrations, and moments of shame or glory, often across dozens of generations. And they didn't memorize it like flashcards. They lived with it. It was braided into how they thought, how they spoke, how they moved. You picture it now. A griot preparing for a performance. They don't sit down and open a scroll. They open their mouth, and from it flows the past, not in straight lines, but in loops. Spirals, reflections, memory, in their hands, is not a bookshelf. It's a river, and they know where all the bends are. Let's say a patron asks the griot to recount a king's ancestry. The griot doesn't just recite a list. They tell a story, and each name is linked not just to the one before, but to a location, an event, a sound. A battle with drumming in the background. A marriage timed to the scent of the first rain. A birth under a certain tree whose roots now brush the walls of the compound. These anchors, sounds, scents, symbols, are the mnemonic landscape. That leads us to our fringe tidbit for the night. Griots were trained to build memory palaces long before the term was coined in Europe. In their case, the palaces were not imagined rooms filled with objects, but lived places, the sacred well, the old tamarind tree, the road to the northern market. Each location housed a memory. Each memory opened a name. And the beauty of it? You didn't have to see it to believe it. You felt it. You remembered it with your feet, with your ears. That spot under the mango tree? That's where your uncle met the trader who brought salt from the desert. That grove with the curved rocks? That's where your grandmother gave birth during a thunderstorm and sang her child's name into the lightning. The griot tied the story to the earth, which is why they rarely told genealogies while sitting still. They moved, they paced, they gestured. They gestured not just to fill the air, but to touch the points of memory spread around them like invisible markers. One griot reportedly pointed to the horizon and said, "There's your fourth grandfather's cousin. Right there, just past that rock that looks like a sleeping lion." And nobody questioned him, because they all saw the lion, too. Which brings us to tonight's scholarly tension. Are these memory feats purely the result of formal training, or is there an embedded cultural cognition that shaped how griots retained information? Some argue it's rote discipline. Start them young, rehearse every day, repeat until perfect. Others point to something subtler. A different way of mapping the world, one that doesn't separate thought from body, or history from geography, or memory from music. Because remember, griots didn't sit in silence. They spoke with a drum behind them, or a string instrument beneath their words. The kora, the balafon, the ngoni, all these were more than music. They were tools of orientation. Think of each note like a page turn, each rhythm a chapter heading, each melodic phrase a family branch unfurling in sound. And if you're wondering how on earth someone could remember all that, well, you've already started. You remember the tree, the thunder, the smell of millet. That's the beginning. That's how griots wove memory, not with lists, but with sensations. You take a breath and realize something strange. You feel fuller. Not in your stomach, but in your mind. As if something ancient has just pulled up a chair and said, "I'll stay for a while." You close your eyes and write this without needing to look at the page. The griot's mind was not a vault. It was a field, a courtyard, a path worn by repetition and blessed by use. Each time they walked it, the path deepened. And each listener, like me, walked a little behind them, learning the turns. The griot does not memorize. They inhabit. The courtyard is dark now. The griot's voice has paused, just long enough for the silence to settle. You don't speak. You just listen. The morning arrives with no hurry. Just a soft push of wind against the cloth door, a rooster in the distance who seems less like he's crowing and more like he's stretching his voice awake. You sit up slowly, the memory of names still echoing in your chest, and you realize something odd has happened. Even though you don't understand the language the griot spoke last night, not really, you remember the rhythm. You remember the rise and fall, the turns of breath, the repetition like footsteps tracing circles around a fire. Somehow, it stuck, which brings you to a very natural question, asked by scholars and sleepy listeners alike. How, exactly, did the griots do it? How do you memorize hundreds, sometimes thousands, of names, dates, birth orders, marriages, rivalries, epic events, and funeral songs without writing a single syllable down? Today's grounded historical fact: West African griots developed structured, systematic techniques for retaining and transmitting enormous quantities of information orally, often over years of apprenticeship and performance-based training. And nowhere was that more evident than in the memorization of genealogies. Not just lists, not just a begat B, who begat C, but textured, living maps of human connection. Because for the griot, a name never existed in isolation. It was always linked to a moment, a mood, a sound, a smell, a mistake, or a blessing. You didn't just remember the man who led the caravan across the Sahel. You remembered the camel that died just before the salt flats, the wife he almost didn't marry, the proverb he muttered when his sandals broke, which later became a household saying. Here's a delicious little fringe tidbit. Some griots reportedly sang names in time to their own heartbeat. Slow and even, like a metronome under the chest. When asked how they didn't lose their place after the 300th name, one griot laughed and said, "You don't lose your place if you're singing to the blood." But what's perhaps most fascinating is that griots never memorized names in a vacuum. Every name was part of a chain. And every chain had a shape. Sometimes it was chronological, sometimes it was matrilineal, sometimes it followed the pattern of settlements, who moved where and why. In certain traditions, a griot could remember 70 generations, not as separate lines, but as one continuous breath. That's over 2,000 years of memory, recited aloud. Now, you may be thinking, okay, sure, they memorized a lot. But isn't that just a bunch of repetition? Sort of, but not like cramming for a history test. A griot didn't just repeat. They performed. The names came wrapped in melody, in rhythm, in layered phrasing. Some scholars call it tonal scaffolding, a musical structure that supports memory. Think of it like jazz. There's a basic progression you follow, but the performer has space to improvise. The result? Every performance is faithful to the facts, but still alive. It breathes. It adjusts to the moment. Which brings us to today's scholarly argument. Were griots primarily preservers of factual lineages, or were they creative interpreters, subtly reshaping memory to suit the needs of the present? The answer, frustratingly, or beautifully, is both. A griot's job was to remember the truth. But truth, as they knew, is often more flexible than facts. So a birth date might slide. A feud might soften. A forgotten cousin might get promoted to hero, if it helped unify a gathering. Accuracy mattered, but so did effect. Let's imagine this in action. You're sitting in the courtyard again. This time, it's a naming ceremony. A baby has just been born into a long-respected family, and the elders want to hear that family's lineage spoken aloud, to welcome the child into the river of memory. The griot steps forward, fingers lightly touching a stringed instrument. The first name floats out like mist. Then another, not shouted, sung. Each name falls in time with the tuning of the strings, like beads sliding onto a necklace. By the time the child is named, the entire history of their people has been braided into the air above them. And not just names, epithets, praise titles, descriptions. He who sleeps with one eye, the woman who carried the rain, the son of iron and salt. These phrases are not random. They are the griot's mnemonic glue. They help anchor memory in texture. And they make the story easier to follow, easier to feel. You're reminded suddenly of a proverb whispered by an old griot in Guinea. A name without a story is a drum without a skin. The griot didn't just remember who you were. They remembered why. And that why was always more than a date. Even the way they practiced had structure. Young griots didn't start by memorizing 700 names. They started with a branch. One family. One story. They repeated it until it stuck. Then another. Eventually, they were asked to sing 2 stories back to back. Then 3. Then 5. And if they missed a detail, their teacher would start clapping softly in a syncopated rhythm, and the student would have to find their way back, on beat. Memory, in this tradition, had a soundtrack. You sip a warm drink now. Something made with ginger and honey, maybe. The courtyard is quiet again. Not because the griot is silent, but because the audience has heard what it came to hear. The proof that no one is ever really forgotten, as long as someone still knows how to sing your name. You write, slowly, softly. The griots remembered not with ink, but with cadence. Not with scrolls, but with sighs. Their memory was never flat. It was folded, layered, echoing with breath and blood. To speak a name was to revive it. To forget a name was to let it fade like morning mist. And the griot would not let that happen, not on their watch. Not while their voice still rose. You lie back now. You listen to your own heartbeat. Slow, even. You wonder whose names it might carry. You're lying down now beneath a sky full of stars so sharp they look like they might hum if you listened closely enough. The earth is warm beneath you, still holding onto the memory of the sun, and somewhere nearby, you hear the low, deliberate pluck of a stringed instrument, gentle, hesitant, like it's waiting for words to arrive and sit beside it. And sure enough, they do. A voice begins, not a story this time, but a list of names. Except it doesn't feel like a list. It feels like a song. And now you understand. This is how memory becomes music. Or maybe, how music becomes memory. Here's your grounded historical fact for tonight. Griots often relied on melodic structures and musical performance to preserve and transmit genealogies. They didn't just recite names, they sang them, infusing each name with tone, rhythm, repetition, and flow. The melody served as scaffolding. The song held the story. And it wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was survival strategy. Because when you need to remember 400 years of familial detail, music gives memory wings. Take the kora, for example, a 21-string harp lute made from a large calabash gourd, covered in cowhide, and topped with a tall neck. Its sound is light, almost crystalline, somewhere between a harp and a banjo. And when played well, really well, it feels like time itself is slowing down just to hear what happens next. You watch the griot tonight cradle a kora in his lap, his thumbs dancing across the strings, the melody looping like a soft incantation. He sings names in waves. One for the child, one for the father, one for the grandfather, 2 for the woman who crossed the river with a pot balanced on her head and a grudge balanced in her heart. Each verse swells and falls, and you realize that even if you don't speak the language, you're beginning to anticipate the rhythm. That's the point. This leads us to our fringe tidbit of the evening. Some griots used specific chord progressions to signal shifts in genealogy. One musical phrase meant, "Now we speak of the matrilineal line," another marked the transition to a rival clan. There was even a melodic cue, subtle, but firm, that meant, This part of the story is disputed, but we're including it anyway. Memory didn't hide its uncertainty. It sang it aloud. And while the kora is the most famous griot instrument today, it wasn't alone. The balafon, a wooden xylophone with buzzing gourd resonators, offered a more percussive companion, especially when telling battle stories. The talking drum, shaped like an hourglass and tuned by squeezing ropes while striking it, allowed the griot to mimic spoken phrases, literally drumming names, sometimes across entire villages. A griot might summon a gathering with a drumbeat that spelled out the syllables of an ancestor's praise name. And the elders would come, knowing exactly whose story was about to be told. Which brings us to tonight's scholarly debate. Was the musical component of griot storytelling primarily a mnemonic device, or was it essential to the content itself? Was the melody a vehicle, or a message? Some argue it was purely practical, music helps memory. But others insist the melody is part of the meaning. That certain names always come in a certain rhythm. That removing the song is like tearing pages from a book. You may remember the facts, but you lose the flavor. You picture a child, maybe 8, maybe 9, listening to this every night. They don't study it, they soak in it. Over time, their brain begins to recognize the patterns. Certain notes mean glory, certain rhythms mean sorrow. Before they can recite a single lineage, they feel its emotional shape. And eventually, they begin to echo it. In some griot families, children learned by shadowing, not sitting down and being lectured, but by listening for years. By the time they were teens, they'd heard their clan's genealogy 100 times. By the time they were adults, they could sing it in their sleep. And often did. You look up again. The stars haven't moved, but you have. You feel like you've drifted downriver, carried by sound, not current. Because these songs aren't just memory tools. They're vessels. To sing someone's name is to keep them from vanishing. And to sing it well? That's love. That's duty. That's art. And not just for kings. The griot might sing for the midwife who delivered twins by lantern light. Or the hunter who brought home nothing but silence, yet was remembered for his kindness. Everyone mattered. Everyone had a song, even if it was short. Even if it was sung once a year when the millet bloomed and the frogs remembered to dance. You sip something warm again. Spiced, probably. The flavor fades slowly, like the song that's just ended. You write, softly, by the light of a flickering lamp. The griot sang not to entertain, but to preserve. Each string carried a name. Each drumbeat held a birth. In their hands, music was not decoration. It was structure. Memory's melody. To forget was dissonance. To remember was harmony. You hear the griot pluck one final chord, a note that lands like a sigh. And the courtyard falls still. By now, the nights feel longer, not in the weary sense, but in the way a good dream stretches just enough to let you stay inside it a little longer. You sit with your back against a mud brick wall, its warmth fading slowly beneath you, while a hush has fallen over the courtyard. Tonight, the griot does not begin with names. Not yet. Tonight begins with an epic. The kind that moves like a river, slow and deep, with hidden bends that catch even the practiced ear off guard. You shift your weight slightly as the griot clears his throat. The kora rests in his lap again, its strings already quivering from the breeze or maybe anticipation. And then, with no grand preamble, he begins. Listen well to the tale of Sundiata, the lion child, the crippled prince, the exile, the founder of empires. Yes, this is the epic of Sundiata, one of the oldest oral epics still recited in Africa today, passed down by griots for nearly 800 years. A living monument to a boy who couldn't walk and yet carried a kingdom on his back. Here's your grounded historical fact. The Epic of Sundiata is a foundational oral tradition of the Mande peoples in West Africa, chronicling the life of Sundiata Keita, the 13th century founder of the Mali Empire. It's not a story in the way you might think. There's no single, official version. There are hundreds. Each griot tells it a little differently. But the core remains. Birth, struggle, exile, return, triumph. Tonight's version begins at the moment of prophecy. A hunter foretells the birth of a king from an unlikely woman, Sogolon, shy and stooped, with eyes like clouded mirrors and hair that never lay flat. Sundiata is born, but he cannot walk. Years pass. He drags himself with his arms while others whisper. A king's son, crawling. You hear the wind shift in the courtyard. The griot leans closer to the mic, or the memory, or the moment. And then the line that always comes. One day, he stood. And the rhythm changes. The drumbeat rises. The griot's voice tightens and sharpens like a bowstring pulled taut. Because from here, the boy becomes a lion. Sundiata, the exile. Sundiata, the warrior. Sundiata, the uniter of fractured kingdoms. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots claim the epic of Sundiata is so long, it must be broken across 7 nights, with specific portions sung only under certain moons or during particular ceremonies. And it's not just narrative, it's lineage. Sundiata's bloodline includes the kings of Mali, the founders of cities, the patrons of markets. If a family in the audience claims descent, the griot may pause, point, and include them by name. Which leads us to tonight's scholarly question. Is the epic of Sundiata primarily myth, or is it reliable history told through a poetic lens? Historians still argue. There's archaeological support for the Mali Empire's rise around the time the epic describes. Some characters line up with known rulers and battles. Others are harder to pin down. But for the griot, this debate misses the point. Truth isn't always about fact. It's about continuity. Sundiata walked, and so did the people. That's what matters. The epic isn't just about one man. It's about the shape of resilience. The way a people hold themselves together through exile and return. The way a name can be carried not by pages, but by people. And tonight, that name is carried by the griot's voice, rising and falling like a tide against the past. You glance around the courtyard. Some of the elders nod gently, eyes closed. Not asleep, just remembering in rhythm. A younger boy mouths along with the words, not quite confident, but close. Maybe next year, he'll speak the lines himself. The griot notices, but doesn't say anything. These things take time. The performance continues. Sundiata returns from exile. He gathers allies. He faces the sorcerer king, Somooro Kante, in a battle thick with drums and fire and riddles. The details differ depending on who's telling it. In some versions, Sundiata defeats Somooro with a magical arrow tipped in the claw of a white rooster. In others, it's a deeper kind of wisdom that wins. But always, the griot delivers the final line with gravity, and so the lion child became the son of Mali. And just like that, it ends. Not with applause, just stillness. The kind that comes when something bigger than you brushes past and leaves your skin tingling. You breathe out slowly, aware that you've just heard something older than most cathedrals. Older than printed books, kept alive not by libraries, but by lungs. You write this in your journal. The epic of Sundiata is not fixed. It lives in the throat, not the page. It grows and shrinks with the breath of the griot. It bends toward the listener and remembers them. It is not less truthful because it sings. It is truthful because it does. You don't speak for a long while. You just sit with the name. Sundiata. It sounds like memory in motion. The embers are gone. What little light remains glimmers from the moon, low and pearly behind a veil of quiet clouds. The courtyard is empty now, save for a few woven mats and the smell of yesterday's wood smoke lingering in the clay. But the griot's voice, somehow, still hums in the corners. As if the story of Sundiata left an imprint on the air. As if it's waiting for someone to pick it back up and carry it further. And that someone might be you. Or someone like you, only much younger. Knees dusty, voice still uncertain, ears wide open. Because tonight, you learn how a griot is made. Here's your grounded historical fact. Griots were born into their roles, typically through hereditary castes, but their training was far from automatic. Apprenticeship began in early childhood and could last decades, demanding intense memorization, musical training, and social observation. A griot was not just someone with a good memory. They were shaped like iron, through heat, through pressure, through repeated folding of knowledge until it could withstand time itself. You imagine the scene now. A small boy crouched beside an elder griot, tasked with listening, just listening, to an hour-long recitation of lineage. No writing, no questions, just ears. He's told to return the next day and repeat it. Not word for word, yet, but rhythm for rhythm, tone for tone. Because before you remember facts, you must remember flow. In the early stages, the child isn't even allowed to speak. Only observe. Sit silently through ceremonies. Listen to arguments. Watch who sits closest to the fire and who is handed the gourd first. Because the griot's job isn't just to remember what's said, it's to understand what's not. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots were trained at night, under moonlight, when the world was quieter and the metaphors ran deeper. Elders claimed that the dark sharpened the senses, that it let you hear the silence between names. One griot from Senegal once said, "In daylight, we remember events. In darkness, we remember people." Training wasn't gentle. A mistake in a genealogy could cause offense, or worse, insult. One misnamed ancestor and a celebration could turn tense. Which is why novice griots would often practice alone in the bush, singing to trees, repeating names to the wind until even the birds knew the lineage. They'd tap rhythms on the backs of their hands, whisper verses into gourds, and learn to recite the same story with 5 different moods: joy, sorrow, reverence, triumph, mourning. Because a griot didn't just speak truth. They shaded it, colored it, let it breathe. And there were tests. Oh yes, not formal exams, but trials of readiness. A young griot might be asked to recite a lineage backwards, or start from a lesser-known cousin and trace forward, or answer riddles that had nothing to do with names but everything to do with wisdom. If you got stuck, your teacher would not scold you. They'd start singing your mistake aloud, rhythmically, until you never forgot it again. Harsh? Maybe, but effective. This brings us to our scholarly debate of the evening. Was the griot apprenticeship system an educational model, a ritual tradition, or a form of social discipline? Some anthropologists treat it as a pedagogical marvel, an oral schoolhouse without walls. Others see it as spiritual formation, almost monk-like, with silence and suffering baked into the process. But perhaps it was simply the only way to preserve something so massive without writing it down. You don't teach a child to carry history casually. You teach them with reverence, and repetition, and rhythm so deep it enters the bones. In some families, the role of griot passed to the eldest child. In others, it was chosen by temperament. A quiet one, a curious one, a child who asked odd questions or hummed to themselves in the garden. Once chosen, they weren't told. They were shown. Their food might be served differently. They'd be asked to listen longer, to sit closer. One day, without fanfare, a teacher would hand them a drum and say, "Try." And that would be that. You imagine yourself at that moment, feet bare, heartbeat fast, your hand hovering over the skin of a talking drum. One word from the teacher, and suddenly it's your job to echo the memory of 100 ancestors. And not get it wrong. No pressure. But you did it, slowly, clumsily, but you would. Because someone had to. And in the world of griots, the memory only survives if someone decides to keep remembering. You lie back again, the sky now completely clear, the stars brilliant and unblinking. And you write. The griot is not born knowing. They are born remembering. Memory is planted in them like a seed, watered by silence, nourished by song. They speak not because they were told to, but because they cannot not speak. They are chosen by rhythm, and forged by night. You close your eyes, and somewhere, a child hums the name of an ancestor into the dark. The stars overhead seem quieter tonight, as if even they're listening. You feel the shift in the air, cooler, heavier, like the world itself is leaning a little closer to the stories being told. You stretch your legs and roll onto your side, eyes half-lidded, heartbeat slow. The griot hasn't begun speaking yet, but you already sense the shape of something coming. Not a story. Not exactly. Tonight is a memory map. You hear a low rustling and the soft tapping of a stick on the ground, an elder's hand tracing lines in the dirt. That, you realize, is the griot's chalkboard. Not for drawing, for pointing. Because tonight's tale doesn't stay put. It travels. It moves across rivers and under trees and around hills. Tonight, the griot teaches you how memory lives in the land. Here's your grounded historical fact. Griots often use geography as a mnemonic framework, tying names, events, and genealogies to specific physical locations so memory could be anchored in space. Villages, wells, boulders, groves, ancient roads, all became filing cabinets in the oral library. And this wasn't metaphor, it was method. Imagine walking with a griot across the savannah. You pass a large termite mound, and they say, "Here is where the brothers quarreled." A bend in the river? That's the path the ancestor took when he returned from exile. A crooked baobab tree? She was born under that one. The midwife swore she heard the roots speak her name. These aren't casual anecdotes. They're coordinates in the mind. Tonight's fringe tidbit. Some griots referred to certain landscapes as song paths, routes where every step corresponds to a line of memory, much like Aboriginal songlines in Australia. The griot didn't need a map. They were the map, and as long as they could walk the path, the story remained whole. You follow the griot now in your mind's eye. They gesture toward the dark, where distant hills sleep like lions. Each hill, each dip, each trail is a chapter. Here, they say, is where the grandmother gave birth to twins during the harmattan, and the wind carried their first cries into the millet fields. You don't need to know exactly where that is. You feel it. It's not direction. It's orientation. The story exists in the terrain of memory. Which brings us to the scholarly conversation of the night. Is this method of geographic memory merely a narrative device, or a culturally specific cognitive system for organizing complex oral data? The more researchers dig, the clearer it becomes. This isn't storytelling flourish. This is infrastructure, like neural pathways paved in dust and wind. In a world without ink or pixel, the griot's geography is the archive. You take another slow breath. Imagine being a child learning this way, not from textbooks, but from walking. Your teacher doesn't lecture. They lead you through the landscape. This is where your great-uncle made peace with his rival, they say, as you stand by a shallow stream. And there, where the fig tree leans, that's where the rain finally came after 3 years of nothing. You nod. You don't forget. How could you? The story is tied to your footsteps. There's a saying among griots. The land remembers what the mouth forgets. And they mean it. If a detail slips, they retrace the walk. Not just to double-check, to re-anchor. And when a settlement is destroyed, or a grove burns, the griot doesn't panic. They find a new landmark. Adjust the story. Because memory, in their world, is not brittle. It bends. You think back to the map you grew up with, the one that hung in your classroom or was folded into your car's glove box. Those maps told you where you were, but they didn't tell you who you were. The Griots map does both. And while we're here, one more fringe gem. In certain regions, Griots crafted memory aids out of objects, knots in leather cords, marks on carved staffs, beads worn during performance. Each bead could represent a generation, each knot a marriage. They weren't magical, they were mnemonic, a necklace that helped you recall the lineage of a fishing family down by the marsh. A walking stick that whispered 10 names with each tap. Tonight, the griot does not sit. They walk, slowly, thoughtfully. Their steps are part of the story. The listeners follow, not just with their ears, but with their bodies. Everyone moves together. The landscape unfolds. You write, now in the dark. The griot walks to remember. Every step a syllable, every hill a grandparent. The world is not divided between story and place. The world is the story. To follow the griot is to read the earth aloud. You sit still, and yet, you feel as though you've traveled for miles. Not by foot, by memory. It's nearly morning now. That soft silver edge of light brushing the sky, when the stars start to retreat, not in fear, but in knowing they've done their part. The courtyard hasn't changed. It's still quiet, still held together by dust and fire scent and the woven hush of listening. But tonight, the story doesn't begin with place or person. It begins with a case. A long, narrow leather satchel, worn soft from handling. It hangs by the griot's side, tied with twisted cord and decorated with tiny cowries and brass studs. And when the griot opens it, the quiet deepens. Not because of what's inside, but because everybody knows what's about to happen. Tonight, the instruments speak. Here's your grounded historical fact. West African griots didn't only rely on their voices. Their performances were supported by specific instruments, each with deep cultural and mnemonic significance. These weren't background music. They were part of the memory mechanism. Extensions of the griot's body. Tools of recall and reverence. The griot lifts a kora from the case first, fingers tracing its neck like an old friend. You've seen it before. 21 strings, stretched across a calabash gourd, a sound as light as birdsong but shaped with precision. The kora doesn't shout, it suggests. It doesn't lead, it remembers. Then comes the balafon, a wooden xylophone laid across gourd resonators. Played with padded mallets, it hums like warm rain on thatched roofs. Each key is tuned to a specific pitch, and some griots had a memory key, a particular note that triggered the next section of a genealogy. Memory, here, is percussive. Next, the talking drum, hourglass shaped with strings that adjust its pitch mid-stroke. The griot slings it under one arm and strikes it gently. The sound wavers, then stabilizes, like a voice remembering itself. In some performances, the drum speaks whole names aloud, syllable by syllable. A skilled griot could hold entire conversations between drum and voice, as if two versions of memory were comparing notes. Here's your fringe tidbit for the night. Some griots customized their instruments not for tone, but for emotional recall. One might tuck a dried leaf inside a balafon gourd to give it a raspier resonance, a reminder, they said, of a grandmother's voice. Another might knot the kora's string ends with fabric from a relative's garment. These were not charms. They were anchors. The past doesn't just live in sound, it lives in texture. And now comes the question. Did griot instruments simply support memory, or did they carry part of it themselves? In other words, is the kora just an accompaniment, or does the act of touching it, hearing it, awaken knowledge otherwise dormant? Some researchers argue that memory is multisensory, that the instrument, once learned with a story, becomes a key that unlocks that story again. Others believe the instrument is ritual, not retrieval. beautiful, but optional. But griots don't seem to draw that line. They don't say, I'll perform this genealogy with or without my kora. They say, I carry my memory with me. And when they say, carry, they mean literally. In wood, in skin, in string. You watch now as the griot tunes the kora by ear. There are no frets, no pegs, just quiet confidence. Each string is tested, adjusted, remembered. And when the tuning is done, the griot plucks a few notes in a rhythm you've never heard before, but feel like you already know. The griot begins to sing. And this time, you notice how the song bends around the strings. How every name lands exactly on the beat. How the repetition of lineage doesn't drone, it dances. A cousin appears, remembered in a brighter key. A rival echoes in the low, slow notes. And somewhere in the back of the melody, you hear the ancestor who left and never came back. The griot does not pause. The drum joins. The story moves. You learn, now, that griots don't perform alone. Their instruments are their chorus, their co-narrators. And sometimes, when the griot's voice falters, the instrument continues. Because memory doesn't stop, it waits, and then reminds you. One last fringe detail. In some traditions, griot families would bury a broken kora with its master, believing that the strings, stretched and played for years, held pieces of his breath. To leave it behind would be like leaving his words unfinished. You lean back, eyes closing, and you write. The griot's voice is not solitary. It sings through wood, buzzes through gourd, echoes through skin. Memory is made of timbre and tension. Each string plucked is a name recalled. Each drumbeat, a breath in the body of the past. The instruments do not accompany. They remember. You don't hear the ending of the song. Not because you weren't listening, but because, somewhere in the rhythm, you joined it. The sun's not quite up yet, but the light has changed. It's a kind of blue-gray hush that settles over everything, the color of unbaked clay or the inside of an eyelid just before you open it. The village is quiet, not asleep, but suspended. And in the midst of that quiet, something remarkable has happened. The griot has stopped singing. But the memory doesn't stop. Because today, you learn how it endured when everything else tried to erase it. Here's your grounded historical fact. During the centuries of colonization, particularly under French imperial rule, West African oral traditions faced immense pressure from European administrative systems that valued written records over spoken ones. Colonial authorities distrusted griots. Oral memory, they believed, was imprecise, biased, unreliable. So they ignored it, or worse, tried to erase it. Paper became law. Genealogies not written down were dismissed. Territories were redrawn without regard to clan memory or sacred geography. And griots? They were called mere performers. The French word was often conteur, storyteller. A charming distraction, a sideshow. But griots were not paper. And they would not fold. Tonight's fringe detail. Some griots began disguising their genealogies as praise songs during French inspections, embedding vital lineage data inside poetic verses so colonial officers wouldn't realize they were hearing legal testimony. A name repeated 3 times wasn't flattery. It was documentation, a metaphor about the well that never runs dry, referred to a matrilineal bloodline. Memory had to hide to survive, and griots knew how to whisper while sounding like they were singing. This leads us to tonight's sharp scholarly tension. Was the griot's voice suppressed under colonial rule, or did it become sharper, more coded, more necessary? On paper, oral tradition declined. Fewer performances were recorded. French school curricula forbade teaching oral epics. But beneath that, griots adapted. They turned weddings into schools, funerals into archives. What could not be written would be sung louder. You walk now beside the edge of an old colonial outpost, its walls crumbling, its flag long gone. But you hear the echo of a talking drum once struck defiantly nearby. A griot performed just outside the gates, naming ancestors the French thought irrelevant. He smiled. They smiled back, politely. And still, he named them. Because the record was not for the colonizers. It was for the cousins standing behind them. You're handed a clay cup of something cool, maybe palm wine, maybe tamarind water. It tastes like stubbornness, sweet, but with grit. And you realize something. Written archives can burn, can be edited, can be lost in war or eaten by mildew. But oral memory, when trained well, survives in motion, in air, in rhythm. You can't confiscate it unless you confiscate the body that remembers. And even then, it only takes one witness to rebuild the whole. One griot from Senegal recalled being summoned during the 1950s to testify in a land dispute where no maps existed. The French court demanded proof of ownership. The griot stood up and began reciting the names of those buried along the border of the land, going back 8 generations. He named the births, the fields, the harvests. The other party could not match him. The judge, confused but out of options, ruled in his favor. That, the griot said later, was our title deed. You sit with that for a moment. The griot didn't need parchment. He had pulse. You might be wondering now, what happened when griots themselves began to read and write? Did it dilute the tradition? Or strengthen it? Another ongoing scholarly conversation. Some believe the advent of writing gave griots new tools. Others fear that once a story is written, it becomes fixed, and griot memory was always about breath, not print. One griot, asked why he never wrote down his genealogy, said, "Because tomorrow, I may sing it differently." And both will be true. The performance you're watching now shifts. It's no longer recitation, it's resistance. The griot starts slowly. Names of warriors who never appeared in textbooks. Battles that weren't recorded, not because they weren't important, but because they weren't French. Then comes a lullaby about a grandmother who brewed beer so strong it turned enemies into friends. A joke, a metaphor, a legal claim. It's all there, braided together. The griot smiles wide, but the message is pointed. This is what we remember. This is who we are. And no empire can file that away. You write, slowly, reverently. When the record books refused their names, the griots sang louder. They bent their language into loops, tucked their memory behind metaphors, stitched their lineage into praise. They spoke where ears were closed. They remembered where pens refused. The archive did not die. It danced. The griot taps the side of the kora once. Not to play, just to remind it that it's still needed. And so are you. You feel it now. That quiet shift that happens when a story grows teeth. It doesn't bite, not yet, but it settles its weight on your shoulders in a way that says, pay attention. The sky has turned the color of cool ash, and the world smells faintly of charcoal, damp clay, and dew. Somewhere, a bird trills once and then decides it's too early to bother. The griot stands just ahead, bathed in the thin gray light, and tonight their voice dips lower, softer, like they're letting you in on a secret that's never been forgotten, only protected. Because now you've left the village. You're in a palace. Tonight, you follow the royal griots of Mali. Here's your grounded historical fact. In the medieval Mali Empire, especially under the reign of Mansa Musa, griots held official positions in court, serving not just as entertainers but as royal advisors, diplomats, and historians. Their role was ceremonial and functional. They stood at the right hand of kings and carried the weight of memory like armor. They didn't just tell stories. They defined legitimacy. Picture the king seated beneath a vast canopy, robes of indigo and gold, the scent of frankincense curling through the columns. Guests arrive, envoys, traders, petitioners, and before anyone speaks, the griot rises. Their voice fills the hall. Here is the lineage of the one you see before you. Here is the blood that flows like the Niger. Here is the man descended from the man who cracked the rock and found water beneath. The audience hushes, because no crown is real until the griot has spoken it into memory. Tonight's fringe tidbit. Some royal griots were so influential that they had the authority to intervene in state affairs, not with laws, but with stories. If a king proposed something that contradicted ancestral precedent, a griot might stand, kora in hand, and softly begin a tale from 3 generations ago, about a ruler who tried something similar. About what went wrong, about how the ancestors had already voted, long ago, in the form of consequence. The king would listen. Sometimes, he would change his mind. This leads us to our scholarly question. Did griots hold actual political power, or was their influence limited to symbolism and ritual? Depends who you ask. Some historians argue that royal griots were essentially keepers of precedent, trusted to recall the right proverb at the right moment. Others suggest they were more like constitutional advisors, their memories serving as checks and balances in the absence of written law. What's certain is this: when a griot spoke in court, people stopped talking. You see it now in your mind's eye, an elaborate gathering for the coronation of a new king. Everyone is dressed in their finest cloth. Drums beat slowly. The air smells of cola nuts and pressed perfume. The king steps forward, but the griot speaks first. We remember his father, and his father's sister, and the famine they endured, and the war they won, and the promise they made. Only then does the crown meet the brow. Because in this tradition, you are not king because you say so. You are king because someone remembers why you should be. That's the heart of it. Not inheritance. Not military might. Memory. The griot doesn't carry a sword, but they carry the names of those who did. And that is its own kind of power. And yet, the job wasn't always easy. Griots had to walk a fine line. Loyal, but honest. Embedded in the court, but not beholden to it. A griot who flattered too much risked losing credibility. One who spoke too sharply risked exile, or worse. So their art became one of nuance. A raised eyebrow. A shift in rhythm. A name emphasized just slightly more than others. A warning disguised as a blessing. There's a story, possibly true, possibly not, of a griot who watched a king grow increasingly cruel. One day, during a festival, the griot sang a praise song that named every wise ancestor but skipped the king himself. The omission echoed louder than any insult. 3 days later, the king changed course. No one mentioned the song again. You watch now as the griot walks through the royal compound. Simple steps, nothing showy. But guards part for them. Ministers nod. Children stare. The griot is not just history. The griot is memory made flesh. One final fringe note before you sleep. In some royal courts, griots were buried standing upright, with a kora in their arms and a last song whispered into the earth. Not because they were musicians, but because they were pillars. To lay them down would be to say the story had ended. And it hadn't. It never does. You right. The royal griot did not wear a crown, but they crowned others. They spoke in the presence of gold and blood, and their words weighed more than either. When the past was unclear, they lit the path. When kings forgot, they reminded. Their memory was not decoration. It was law. You lie back, the image still flickering behind your eyelids. A lone figure in the Hall of Kings, standing straight, with history resting lightly in their throat. And you know they will speak again tomorrow. The sky has turned the color of brushed silver, just before dawn takes its first confident breath. You're still lying there, still under the spell of voices that don't shout to be remembered, voices that curl instead, delicate as smoke, sturdy as rope. But tonight, you notice something new in the chorus. A softer thread, a different rhythm, a story not booming from the throne room or galloping down a battlefield. It comes from the kitchen fire, from behind a half-closed door, from a voice slightly hoarse from song and slightly weary from waiting. Tonight, you listen to the women Griots. Here's your grounded historical fact. Although Griots have long been associated with male figures, especially in the formal courts, women played vital, often under-acknowledged roles in preserving and transmitting oral histories, particularly in domestic, musical, and ritual contexts. They were known by many names depending on the region: Griots, Jalimasau, or sometimes simply, the mothers who remember. And they remembered everything. You might not see them in the spotlight of royal ceremonies, but look closer. Behind the wedding guests, she's there, near the mother of the groom, humming a praise song. During funerals, she's the one who starts the wail that isn't just grief. It's the opening verse of a remembered life. And in the quiet of the evening, after the food is gone and the moon is high, she teaches a girl how to say her grandmother's name without stumbling. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some women Griots specialized in intimate memory, lineages carried through the maternal line, stories of childbirths, conflicts between sisters, migrations told from the perspective of the ones who stayed behind. Their memories weren't less public. They were more rooted, domestic, not in the way that means lesser, but in the way that means essential. You picture one now, seated in a low stool, grinding millet with rhythm so steady it becomes percussion. She hums names between each press of the stone. Her granddaughter hums back, no stage, no audience, but the story passes all the same. In many families, it was the women Griots who remembered not just the ancestors, but the emotions attached to them. Your great-aunt always added too much pepper to the stew, she says with a chuckle. And your grandfather never danced unless he heard the drum from 3 houses away. These aren't just anecdotes. They're emotional tags. They make the names stick. They humanize the line. This leads us to tonight's scholarly tension. Were women Griots historically marginalized by patriarchal court structures, or did they develop a distinct, parallel memory system equally vital to cultural preservation? Some argue they were sidelined. Others insist they simply operated in a different frequency, one not measured by ceremony, but by consistency. One griot sang every evening while shelling groundnuts. Her son became a griot. He said later he learned more from those songs than from any apprenticeship. And you wonder, how many griots were raised not by decree, but by lullaby? You sip a cup of something warm, hibiscus, maybe, with a hint of ginger. The air smells like damp earth and distant fire. A griot begins to sing nearby. Not a lineage this time, but a cradle song. Child of the woman who crossed the river, child of the woman who stitched the baskets, child of the woman who sang until the fish leapt. You are named, and you are not alone. You don't need to understand every word. You feel the weight of it anyway. And sometimes, the griots were not quiet at all. In weddings, their songs could be playful, even mischievous, poking fun at in-laws, recalling past loves, or reminding the groom that his father once danced with 2 left feet. Memory here is not dry record. It's full of spice, full of side eyes and slow grins. And that, too, is history. In funerals, they keened, not as performance, but as invocation. Their wails weren't just grief. They were cues. This is the name to remember. This is the sorrow to carry. This is the story not to let go. And when war came, and the men left, and the griots who stood in court were silenced or killed, it was often the women griots who kept the memory going. Through weaving songs, through food, through the stories they muttered while combing a child's hair, the thread never broke. You write now, slowly, by the soft edge of coming light. The women remembered in quieter tones, but no less vivid. Their stories lived in steam and salt, in rhythm and repetition. They were the griots of the heart, remembering the way someone laughed, the time they cried in the rain, the way their name always came second in the song, but still mattered. They held the memory no one else thought to keep. And you realize, this too is a lineage, a matrilineal map drawn in voice. And it hums beneath the Griots' song like a second current in a deep river. The sky has lightened into a soft wash of early day, more suggestion than sunrise. No birds yet, no breeze, just the gentle hush that follows a long remembering. You lie still, listening for footsteps, expecting another royal tale or thunderous battle. But what drifts toward you now is something smaller, humbler, and more intimate. A different kind of epic. One not gilded in ceremony or echoed by drums, but shaped by calloused hands, shared bowls, and a name passed down between mouthfuls of millet. Tonight, no, this morning, you hear the lineage not of kings, but of a butcher. Because griots remembered everyone. Here's your grounded historical fact. West African griots were not exclusive to royalty or nobility. They also preserved the lineages and deeds of ordinary families, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, market women, and yes, butchers, anchoring local identity within the larger social memory. You didn't have to rule a kingdom to be remembered. You just had to matter to someone. In fact, in many villages, griots were most valued not for their high-status performances, but for their ability to speak the lives of everyday people aloud. Accurately, compassionately, and with just the right amount of embellishment. Because memory wasn't a privilege. It was a community right. You picture it now. A village celebration, maybe a naming ceremony or the end of a harvest fast. The drums have gone quiet for a moment. The food is being passed. And the griot steps forward, not to chant of war or empire, but to praise the family who has hosted the feast. They start with the grandfather, who raised goats that survived the 3-year drought. Then the grandmother, who sold cloth in the shade of the kapok tree. Then the son, now grown, who butchers clean, quick, and kind. The griot pauses there. This man cuts not for cruelty, they say, but with care. His blade knows the bones better than the bones know themselves. The audience laughs, then nods. They know it's true. Here's your fringe tidbit. Griots would often create poetic nicknames or praise epithets for everyday figures. Gifts of language that transformed work into legacy. A fisherman might be called, "he who pulls the moon from the water." A midwife becomes, "the one whose hands hear the heart." These phrases weren't exaggerations. They were memory spells. Verbal charms to make a name stick. This brings us to tonight's, this morning's, scholarly question. Was this common memory considered as valuable as royal lineage, or was it seen as oral filler, decoration for ceremonies? Some academics, especially early ethnographers, dismissed it as entertainment. But more recent work reveals a deeper truth. These minor genealogies, when taken together, form the actual body of a people's history. Royalty may crown a culture, but community gives it roots. And griots knew the roots better than anyone. They could name every weaver in the northern quarter for 4 generations. They knew which family once grew the tallest yams and whose eldest daughter sang like a flute. These details were not trivial. They grounded the present. They answered the question, "Who are you?" with something more beautiful than just a surname. There's a village in Niger where, even today, griots recite the names of blacksmiths during the forging of new tools, not out of habit, but because it's believed the spirit of the ancestors strengthens the iron. The griot stands nearby, murmuring, "Son of Dogo, grandson of Dogo, whose hammer never cracked before its time." And when the tool is finished, it's not just strong. It's remembered. Back in the courtyard, the griot sings softly now. They list the butcher's lineage, not the mighty, but the meticulous. He who fed the village when the market failed. She who taught her children to portion fairly. They who never wasted fat, and honored the bone. It doesn't sound like legend. It sounds like truth. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it legendary. You take your notebook again. The page smells faintly of smoke and sleep. You write. The griot remembered kings, yes, but also cousins. The ones who stayed, who tilled, who taught. Their names did not travel far, but they echoed long. Memory did not rise only in throne rooms. It settled in kitchens, in markets, in the soft bark of a family tree known by heart. Every name carried weight, because every life did. You pause. Then add, quietly, and that butcher? The one who portioned with care. He sang to his goats. That part's not legend. That part's just lovely. The griot smiles. The sky has begun to warm now, faint bands of amber stretching over the rooftops like a slow yawn. The courtyard, so alive with memory just hours ago, is soft now. Folded. The voices are quieter, the instruments packed away. But the griot remains, sitting cross-legged beside a low wall, tracing patterns into the dust with a twig. You watch in silence, expecting another epic. But what comes next isn't triumphant. It's not even certain. Because this morning, we slip into something more delicate. What happens when a griot gets it wrong? Here's your grounded historical fact. While griots were revered for their encyclopedic recall, they were still human, and mistakes, contradictions, and even deliberate omissions did happen. Memory was powerful, but also political. Not every ancestor was heroic. Not every tale ended neatly. And sometimes, what was remembered depended on who was listening. You picture a gathering, wedding, maybe, and the griot begins the lineage. Names roll out like woven cloth. And then, a pause. A name skipped, just barely. The audience tenses. One uncle stiffens. A cousin glances sideways. No one speaks, but the silence sharpens like a knife. The griot has omitted someone. Now, maybe it was an accident. Maybe the name simply slipped in the heat of the moment. Or maybe, and this happens more often than people like to admit, it was intentional. Because memory isn't neutral. It reflects power, shame, pride, and sometimes fear. The griot, after all, is not just reciting. They're curating. And here's your fringe tidbit. There are stories of entire families lobbying griots to emphasize or downplay certain details. Highlight the noble marriage. Forget the scandalous exile. Maybe tuck that cousin's questionable business into the folds of metaphor. One griot joked, "I can make a fisherman sound like a prince, but it'll cost extra salt." Which brings us to our scholarly tension. Were griots objective historians, or were they strategic narrators, shaping memory to maintain social cohesion? Some say the role demanded factual precision, names, dates, relationships handed down word perfect across generations. Others argue griots were more like diplomats, balancing truth with tact, preserving unity with just enough convenient forgetting. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the tension. There's a proverb the griot mutters now, still drawing in the dirt. The mouth does not forget, but it sometimes chooses silence. And you feel the weight of it. Because forgetting, for a griot, wasn't failure. It was sometimes a form of grace. You hear stories of griots who refused to name feuding ancestors in the same performance, splitting the lineage like a river at a stone. Others deliberately left gaps, letting the community fill them in as needed. Still others recited parallel versions of events, placing the burden of interpretation on the listener. This is how your mother's side remembers it, they might say, but your father's people sing a different tune. Memory, in their hands, was not rigid. It was responsive. And yes, there were consequences. A forgotten name at a wedding could cause offense. A disputed lineage recited at a funeral could spark an argument that lasted months. In one village, a griot was temporarily exiled after naming a family line backward. He returned 3 years later with a perfect recitation. All was forgiven. But most of the time, mistakes weren't punished. They were noticed, gently corrected, retold in corners. Because the community didn't just listen to the griot. They listened with them. Memory was collective. The griot carried it, yes, but others helped hold it in place. And sometimes, even the griot admitted doubt. You remember this one. A griot performing a particularly long lineage paused after 37 names and said, "Now, I may have sung too early. But if I wait for certainty, you'll miss your meal." The crowd laughed, and he continued, confidence restored by rhythm, if not by fact. That's the beauty of it, you think. The griot is not a machine. They are a vessel, and sometimes the vessel shakes. But it does not spill. You write, with care. The griot remembers with precision, but not without perspective. Memory, in their voice, is a mirror with angles. Sometimes it gleams. Sometimes it hides. But always, it reflects. What is left out can be as revealing as what is sung. And the silence between names? That too is part of the story. You close your notebook slowly, as if not to disturb the lines still being drawn in the dust. The griot looks up, smiles, and says nothing. The sun is just beginning to stretch its fingers over the village rooftops, painting everything in long, low angles of gold. The courtyard glows softly, shadows pooling under benches and firewood stacks. Children are still asleep. The chickens haven't begun their committee meetings yet. And in this gentle quiet, the griot leans forward, adjusting a string on the kora, and begins to hum. Not a melody of kings or queens, but something sharper, steadier, more ceremonial. Because now you step into a different side of the griot's world. Not performance, but procedure. Today, you learn that the griot's memory was more than a cultural treasure. It was, quite literally, a legal tool. Here's your grounded historical fact. Griots frequently served as arbiters or witnesses in disputes, especially those involving land ownership, inheritance, and family obligations, because of their deep knowledge of community lineages and past agreements. In societies without centralized written record-keeping, the griot was the archive. The law library, the family ledger. Their memory could settle a feud faster than a tribunal. You imagine it now. A wide clearing, two families facing one another under the shade of a mango tree. The air is thick, the tension palpable. One family claims a plot of land near the river belongs to them. Has always belonged to them. The other insists it was gifted away 2 generations ago. There is no paper, no deed, only stories. And so the griot is summoned. He arrives quietly, no flourish, just a man with a drum and a memory sharpened by years of listening. He asks for silence, then begins. This land was first cleared by the son of Dembele, who wed the daughter of Konate under the red moon. Their son watered the fields here with his bare hands. When the river moved, the border moved with it. The land was loaned, but never given. That was agreed on the day the lion was chased from the hills. You blink. It sounds like poetry. But for the villagers, this is binding testimony. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots developed verbal contracts, encoded into song, ceremonial verses performed when land was transferred, when debts were forgiven, or when dowries were exchanged. These verses were designed to be memorable, repeatable, and audibly traceable across generations. A griot might open a case by saying, "I was there when the yams were counted. I remember the drumbeat that followed the handshake." These weren't metaphors. They were receipts. Now, the scholarly tension. Was this role of griots in legal matters formalized within traditional governance systems, or was it an informal function based on trust and memory? Some researchers argue griots were legal professionals in everything but title, called upon like notaries or arbitrators. Others suggest their influence was more ad hoc, invoked when other methods failed. Either way, the griot's word carried weight. They didn't need robes or gavels. They had rhythm, they had lineage, they had presence. And yes, griots were challenged sometimes, especially when memory clashed with power. A nobleman might dispute a land claim. A merchant might try to recast a debt. In those moments, the griot would respond not with anger, but with precision. A perfectly timed verse. A proverb spoken just so. A pause so long and loaded that even the mango leaves held their breath. One griot was famously asked, "What if your memory is wrong?" He replied, "Then the land will correct me." Because griot memory wasn't just social. It was environmental. If he forgot a name, he'd look at a tree, a path, a stone. The land itself remembered, and so did the people. Disputes often ended not with verdicts, but with shared nods. A quiet acceptance that if the griot said it, it must have been so. And even if it wasn't exactly as they recalled, the authority of their memory restored order. You sip something bitter this morning, coffee, perhaps, with no sugar. It suits the tone. The griot taps the kora once, and the final names of the land's past owners ripple through the courtyard. There's no applause, just the sound of agreement. You right, pen steady now. The griot was not just a vessel of culture, but a guardian of balance. Their memory resolved what might otherwise rupture. They held the past not as nostalgia, but as reference. When records failed, they recited. When conflict rose, they reminded. Their voice was not just truth, it was context. And you sit for a moment, thinking of all the things your own life depends on. All the paperwork, the passwords, the documents in drawers. Then you close your eyes, and imagine someone stepping forward, quietly, and remembering you. Not because they had to, but because it was their role. The morning has stretched itself into full bloom now. Roosters crow. Distant pestles thud against millet. Smoke curls from low clay stoves, the air warm with the scent of early porridge and ash. But the griot, seated in the shade, does not join the daily bustle. Today is for something older than breakfast, older than dust, older even than blood. Today, the memory comes out loud. Not just spoken, sung and answered. You're about to witness something elemental, something that predates the griot's instruments, the village square, even written script, the ancient rhythm of call and response. This is where griot memory performs itself. Here's your grounded historical fact. Call and response structures are a foundational aspect of West African oral tradition, especially in griot performance. They serve not only as musical devices, but as tools for audience engagement, communal affirmation, and dynamic memory recall. A griot doesn't just speak into silence. They speak into a chorus. A living, breathing memory net, woven in real time by the people listening. The format is simple. The griot calls. A line, a phrase, a name. The audience responds. Sometimes with a word, sometimes with a chant, sometimes with nothing more than a rhythm struck on the thighs or snapped from fingers. But that echo matters. Because when a name is repeated, it becomes anchored. And when everyone remembers it together, it cannot be lost. Here's your fringe tidbit. In some performances, griots train specific audience members ahead of time to act as memory prompts, feeding cues or repeating key lines to support longer genealogical chains. These were called memory mirrors. In some regions, not passive listeners, but active co-reciters who could reflect and reinforce. Imagine a courtyard packed with people. A wedding. A harvest. A naming day. The griot steps forward. They lift the kora but don't play it yet. They speak the name of a great-grandfather. Candia. The one who crossed the floodplain barefoot, who carried millet in one hand and a blade in the other. The audience answers, "Yes, Candia." And with that, the story begins. It's electric. The griot is not performing for the people. They're performing with them. And the more the audience echoes, the deeper the griot goes. Like breathing. Inhale. Call. Exhale. Response. You can almost feel it. A collective memory being shaped, lifted, shared in real time. Now here's where it gets scholarly. Does this call and response format serve primarily as emotional amplification, or does it function as a mnemonic system unto itself? Some researchers argue it's about energy, a way to keep the performance alive. Others insist it's cognitive, an oral technique that reinforces structure, sequence, and retention. But griots don't spend time in those debates. They just do it, because they know that when memory is repeated, it settles deeper. And when it's sung by many voices, it belongs to no one and everyone at once. This isn't just technique, it's architecture. The griot calls out a matrilineal chain now, naming the women who birthed the mothers of the women who fed this village for generations. The audience responds softly after each name. Some with reverence, some with pride, some with that sharp, unspoken edge of grief that comes when memory meets longing. And in some versions, the griot deliberately leaves out a line. To see if the audience remembers. It's not a mistake. It's a challenge, a trust fall, a test of communal recall. And when the correct name echoes back, the griot nods. You remember. Good. Then we go on. There's something deeply moving about this. Because it means that the burden of memory is not the griot's alone. The griot is a channel, but the people carry the current. Even children join. They don't know all the names, but they know the rhythm. They shout the refrain. And eventually, they learn the verses too. Memory doesn't descend like a scroll. It rises like a tide. You write now, the page catching flecks of sunlight through the slats above. The griot calls, but the echo completes the story. Memory is not a solo act. It is a conversation, layered, rhythmic, communal. What is repeated becomes real. What is echoed cannot be erased. When the people respond, the past is restored. You sit back. The griot has fallen silent again, but the audience continues to hum. Soft. Sure. Because now, they know it too. The sun now rests gently atop the rooftops, not yet harsh, but present, spilling light like a patient elder watching the morning stretch awake. The market is beginning to stir with that soft symphony of clinking metal, rustling baskets, and the distant bartering of bread for thread. And still, you sit near the courtyard's edge, beneath a fig tree that hasn't yet caught the heat of the day. The griot has set aside the kora, not out of weariness, but because today's memory will not be sung in courts or echoed through ceremony. No, today's lineage is told in the open air, where griots meet the market. Here's your grounded historical fact. In addition to royal functions and family ceremonies, many griots worked regularly in public spaces like markets and crossroads, offering short-form performances, praise songs, genealogical recitations, or improvisational tales in exchange for food, money, or favors. They were not cloistered artists, walled off from the everyday world. They were embedded in it, moving through the same dust, sharing the same gossip, remembering not from a distance but among. You picture it vividly now. The market bustling, colorful cloths flapping on tent poles, children darting between baskets of kola nuts, and amid it all, a griot leaning against a woven fence, fingers idly strumming a stringed instrument not because a crowd has asked, but because they might. One vendor drops a coin beside them, not for music, but for memory. A praise song begins, tailored to the woman who just sold 4 baskets of tamarind. The griot names her father, then her grandfather, then a cousin who once cured a village elder with a poultice made of salt and dust and luck. The crowd laughs, not because the tale is grand, but because they remember it too. This is not grand performance. This is daily remembering. Gentle, close, alive. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots kept ledgers not on paper, but in rhythm, short, memorized songs they could adapt for bartering families, embedding genealogies into melodic phrases that matched the movement of the market. One griot might have 15 different tunes for 15 regular fishmongers, each beginning with the line, "Daughter of the river's scent," but ending with details specific to the week's fortune. Last Friday, your brother caught 6 catfish in a net made by your husband's cousin. Praise be to the twine that held. That's not a fable. That's an archive in verse. Now we arrive at today's scholarly inquiry. Did these informal performances serve primarily as entertainment, or were they integral to the preservation of communal identity outside institutional structures? Some argue that griots in markets were improvisers first, guardians second, performing for survival. But others insist these performances carried the same weight as courtly ones, if not more, because they represented memory spoken where it was most needed, in the churn of life, amid salt and sweat and barter. And there's something deeply democratic about it, too. In the market, anyone could be remembered. The woman with the crooked baskets? The boy who stole groundnuts and apologized? The elder who didn't speak but nodded wisely? All could find themselves wrapped in verse. And for some, these were the only stories that would ever be told about them. No scroll, no statue, just a few lines, spoken by a griot beneath the neem tree, before the sun got too high. You see it now, not just as performance, but as nourishment. The griot feeds the village something more lasting than bread. They offer continuity, connection, a moment of you matter, delivered casually between stalls of yams and calabashes. And let's not forget the humor. Griots in marketplaces often used satire and playful teasing as mnemonic hooks, poking gentle fun at a man's new sandals or a woman's rumored suitor. One griot famously opened with, "Son of the man who swore he'd never drink palm wine again, until last night." The crowd burst into laughter, and the man being teased handed over a handful of dried meat in appreciation. The teasing wasn't insult. It was memory flavored with spice. You right now, leaning into the warm wood of your seat, sunlight sliding across your paper. The griot in the marketplace is no less a keeper than the griot in the palace. Their memory walks with the people. It breathes in barter and clings to baskets. They sing not for thrones, but for sellers. And in doing so, they preserve the lineage of the land not by decree, but by rhythm. Where coins are traded and names are forgotten, the griot remembers them back into being. You sit for a while longer, watching the slow spill of day into the bones of the street. A goat bleats. A child sings half a song, off-key but certain. And in the corner, a griot plucks a single note. Just one. It is enough. Now the day has fully arrived, stretching its limbs over rooftops, dipping fingers into clay pots of boiling millet, scattering itself across courtyards and cooking fires and the backs of passing goats. You move into the shade, where the air is cooler, edged with the scent of drying herbs and old leather. The griot is still speaking, though the rhythm has changed. Today's memory does not move in open circles or public exchanges. Today, it settles somewhere more complex, where two traditions have learned to share space. Because now you enter the realm where the spoken word meets the written verse, where Islamic literacy and griot memory intertwine. Here's your grounded historical fact. From as early as the 11th century, Islam had a major presence in West Africa, especially in urban centers like Timbuktu and Gao. bringing with it a strong tradition of Arabic literacy, Quranic scholarship, and record-keeping. But instead of displacing griot culture, it often grew alongside it. In many regions, griots and Islamic clerics existed side by side, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony, and sometimes in the very same family. You picture it now. A compound in an old Sahelian town, its mud walls cool in the heat. Inside, two brothers sit, one bent over a worn wooden tablet, ink-black script flowing beneath his fingers as he chants verses from the Quran. The other sits nearby, legs folded, quietly plucking a kora, humming the names of their maternal ancestors in time with the string. Two forms of memory, two lineages, both sacred, both valid. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots were trained in Arabic and could read and write, but chose to keep their historical recitations oral, believing that writing diminished the living energy of the tale. One griot was recorded saying, "A book waits. A voice travels." He didn't mean it dismissively. Just differently. The book records. The voice reanimates. This brings us to today's scholarly tension. Did the rise of Islamic literacy weaken griot traditions by favoring the written word, or did it enrich them with new tools and perspectives? There are arguments on both sides. Some believe that Islamic influence introduced hierarchies that devalued oral knowledge. Others highlight how griots absorbed Islamic phrases, dates, even cosmologies, adapting without surrendering. One historian called it the braided rope, two traditions wrapped around the same thread of remembrance. You walk now through the heart of an old West African city, maybe Djenne, maybe Kano. Minarets rise above clay rooftops. Call to prayer echoes down alleyways. But if you listen carefully, beneath the recitation, you can hear another rhythm. The griot's voice, not in opposition, in counterpoint. They remember different things, but both hold weight. In some households, griots worked alongside marabouts, Islamic scholars and spiritual guides. The marabout kept records of births and legal pacts in Arabic script. The griot remembered the story of the mother's cravings during pregnancy. The marabout traced inheritance laws. The griot traced bloodlines through marriage and clan. Together, they built a fuller truth, ink and breath, parchment and song. One griot famously referred to his own mind as a maktaba, an Arabic word for library. But mine, he said, has no walls and cannot burn. It was a quiet nod to the loss of many manuscripts in colonial raids, in fires, in decay. And a quiet boast. My archive lives because I do. You take a slow breath. The air smells of chalk dust and tamarind. A young boy walks past, holding a Quranic slate in one hand and humming a song his grandmother taught him in the other. He doesn't seem confused. He's not choosing. He's inheriting both. And in griot songs from the 18th and 19th centuries, Islamic names begin to appear: Ahmad, Umar, Fatimata, woven seamlessly into lineages that also include spirit dreams and river oaths. This wasn't contradiction, it was context. The griot remembers the people, and the people embraced both revelation and remembrance. You write now in the margin of your notebook, pressed against your knee. The griot did not vanish when the book arrived. They leaned closer, they listened, and then they remembered what the book did not say. The way the baby wailed on its naming day, the smell of spice in the wedding dish, the laughter before the prayer began. The griot did not argue with the verse. They completed it, and as you sit there, shaded by an acacia tree with tiny yellow blooms, you realize something small but mighty. The griot's tradition did not need to defend itself. It absorbed, it adjusted, and it kept singing. Because while ink may fix history, memory makes it move. The day stretches now in full stride, the air shimmering faintly where the sun kisses the stones. Laughter trickles from a nearby alley. The market has bloomed into its midday pulse, colorful fabrics snapping in the wind, vendors calling out prices in tones so rhythmic they could be mistaken for chants. But not far from the edge of all this bustle stands a quiet house, one with shutters drawn, its garden still, its doorway shadowed. Inside, a griot sits alone, back straight, gaze steady, facing something not made of string or skin or memory trails. Instead, before them lies a typewriter, or perhaps a tape recorder, or maybe just a white man with a notebook and a question. Because now, you've reached a turning point, the colonial era, and the silence it tried to impose. Here's your grounded historical fact. During the height of European colonization in West Africa, particularly under French rule, griot traditions were actively suppressed, misunderstood, or co-opted. Colonial administrators viewed oral historians with suspicion, favoring written records and bureaucratic standardization over indigenous memory systems. Griots, who once sat beside kings and settled land disputes by naming the dead, now found themselves questioned, categorized, and in many cases, ignored. In French colonial courts, written deeds were considered valid oral testimonies, even those by griots with perfect recall were dismissed as hearsay. When land was taken, the griot's memory meant nothing. The paper ruled. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots began deliberately embedding counter-colonial narratives inside traditional epics, slipping anti-imperial metaphors and coded criticisms into old stories under the guise of lineage recitation. A griot in Senegal once ended a praise song with, "And the son who claimed the grain but never sowed it, his house was made of mirrors." No one needed it explained. This leads us into today's academic tension. Did colonization irrevocably damage griot traditions, or did it force an adaptive evolution that deepened their role? Some scholars see the colonial period as a rupture, a silencing. Others see it as a crucible. The griots, they argue, did not go silent. They changed tone. You imagine it now. A griot called into a colonial office, seated on a wooden bench, his hands folded, listening as an administrator asks for the official version. He begins speaking, not slowly, but carefully. He names ancestors not as warriors, but as keepers of soil. He replaces conquest with protection, spirit oaths with family agreements. The official nods, scribbles something down, but the griot's eyes remain unreadable, because what he said, and what he meant, were two different things. And in the villages, the griots carried on. When French officers passed by, they told stories of lions and rain. But once they were gone, the old verses returned. The names realigned, the truth uncoiled, safe once more in familiar ears. One griot, recorded in the 1930s, said quietly into a wax cylinder, "They made us right, but we still remember the sound." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He knew that memory, his kind of memory, didn't live in ink. It lived in pauses, in timing, in the muscle behind the tongue. And you couldn't confiscate that. Here's something to let sit on your chest a moment longer. Some griots served as cultural translators during this era, called upon to explain local customs to colonial agents. They walked a tightrope. Be truthful, and risk reprisal. Be quiet, and risk irrelevance. Most chose a third way. Speak in such layered code that only their people would truly hear. You write slowly now, as if each word must be weighed. The griot met the colonizer with a face of calm and a voice of ashwood, flexible, dense, hard to burn. What they said aloud was translation. What they sang beneath their breath was preservation. They wrapped their stories in folds, stitched truths into the hems, and handed them back looking like gifts. But they were messages, carried in rhythm, delivered in metaphor, received in full by those who already knew. You look up. A child runs past with a string of dried gourds clinking behind him like a memory chasing its echo. Somewhere, a griot tunes an old radio, not for music, but for weather. Because even the air can carry stories now. And as the sun climbs higher, you realize this. The silence colonialism tried to impose was never empty. It was filled with griots whispering louder in ways that couldn't be measured. The archive did not vanish. It simply stopped performing for those who couldn't hear. The air is thick now, not from heat alone, but from time. It hangs between you and the sun, heavy with unspoken names and the soft rustle of things remembered behind closed teeth. The market has quieted for its midday lull, shade gathered beneath awnings, and even the goats lie down in surrender. But the griot remains upright, still, eyes open, not gazing outward, but inward. Because today, the memory leaves the courtyard and walks into a space it was never meant to enter, but did anyway. A colonial courtroom. Here's your grounded historical fact. During the colonial period, griots were at times summoned into Western-style legal courts to testify in land disputes, inheritance cases, or family quarrels, particularly when written documentation was lacking or contested. Their role in these trials was complicated, even precarious. They were not there to sing. They were there to prove. Imagine it now. A dusty administrative building, its roof patched with tin, the walls painted in a shade of beige so oppressive it saps the color from your very clothes. Inside, a griot stands in front of a judge who does not know his name, does not understand his rhythm, and does not care about the names of goats. But the land in question, 2 kilometers of good, dark soil near the bend in the river, hangs in the balance. And the only person who remembers the names of those who worked it, who married on it, who bled for it, who buried kin beneath its trees, is the griot. He does not have a document. He has breath. He has syllables. He has 300 years of memory balanced in his chest like a pot on a head. And he begins. This land was cleared by Bamoya, son of Kuroba, who wed Madu in the season of the second flood. Their daughter, Sareta, married into the Dabo family, and on the morning of the Black Rains, her brother exchanged land for cattle. 14 head, no less. The judge frowns. No dates, no map, no seal, just names. And yet, each one of those names is known by the village. If the griot lies, the walls will whisper it. But he doesn't. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some colonial courts began to unofficially recognize griots as legal witnesses, especially in rural disputes where formal documentation simply didn't exist. Their memory became a kind of living affidavit, not because the system respected it, because it had no other choice. But this was not a gentle transition. The griot's tone had to shift, no longer poetic, but linear. Less song, more spine. They could not laugh in court. They could not tease or coax. Their memory had to be trimmed to fit the frame of a ledger that could never hold its full shape. This brings us to the scholarly tension. Was this use of griots in colonial courts a validation of oral history, or a distortion? Forcing an embodied tradition into a foreign format? Some argue it showed grudging respect. When all else failed, the griot was called. Others argue it reduced them to data providers, stripping away their metaphor, their mood, their meaning. Turning rhythm into record. And yet, they adapted. A griot might appear with a short staff, carved with notches for each generation. He might tap the ground once for each name, creating a drumbeat beneath his words. He might quote a proverb so old that even the French clerk paused to write it down. The tree does not forget its seed. It meant nothing to the file folder. But to those listening, it meant everything. You imagine the scene. The opposing party smirking, offering forged papers, crooked signatures. The griot standing barefoot, unshaken, and whispering the name of a grandmother who died with a handful of soil from that land still clutched in her hand. The silence that followed, the weight of truth that cannot be notarized. And then, when it's all over, the griot walks home. Not triumphant, not defeated, just enduring. His memory still intact, his rhythm still unbroken, his breath still full of names. You write slowly now, hand steady in the heat. The griot stood where parchment failed. In the court, they did not shout. They recited, quietly, surely. Their memory could not be indexed. But it could be heard. They answered to no ink. Only to the land, only to the name, and the soil beneath their feet remembered with them. You close your eyes for a moment. Not from exhaustion, from respect. Because memory, when summoned in defense, becomes a kind of shield. And the griot? Still standing. Still singing, just softer. The afternoon lays itself down like an old dog, quiet, heavy, sun-warmed and without urgency. The village hums at half-speed now, its pulse slowed to match the heat. You sit beneath the same fig tree, its shade unchanged, but your mind turning, still following the griot through every fold of history. But now, something changes. Not in the setting, not in the voice, in the audience. Today, the griot performs for a room of strangers. Today, the griot walks into a museum. Here's your grounded historical fact. From the mid-20th century onward, as anthropology and ethnomusicology expanded, griots were increasingly invited, or sometimes summoned, to perform for academic researchers, visiting dignitaries, and museum audiences in Europe and North America. These appearances, often framed as cultural exhibitions, placed the griot in a new and alien space, no longer performing for their own communities, but for audiences who couldn't speak their language, follow their references, or respond to their calls. You picture it now. A modern auditorium, rows of stiff chairs filled with tourists and professors, a soft whir of translation headsets and distant cell phones being silenced. A griot steps out onto the stage, not a courtyard, not a ceremony, not even a wedding tent, but a stage, framed by velvet curtains and dimmed lights. He carries his kora. He wears robes sewn by his cousin. He begins to speak, slowly, cautiously. He names a lineage, but no one in the audience knows the people. He sings a praise song, but no one responds. He calls out, "Son of the blacksmith who tamed the desert wind." Silence. No laughter. No echo. Only polite, puzzled clapping. Here's your fringe tidbit. In the 1970s, several griots began composing performance adaptations of traditional genealogies specifically tailored for foreign audiences, stripping references, simplifying metaphors, and shortening sequences to fit into timed exhibitions. These adaptations were sometimes necessary for understanding, but often painful. One griot reportedly said, "I gave them the bones, but not the breath." And so, we arrive at today's scholarly tension. Do such performances preserve griot heritage by sharing it globally, or do they dilute it into cultural spectacle, disconnected from the environments and audiences that give it meaning? One camp insists that exposure leads to preservation. Another argues that translation always trims truth. That a griot in a Paris museum is not a griot, but an echo of one. The truth, as before, likely lies somewhere murky and bittersweet. Because the griot in that museum did not forget his lines. His memory was sharp, his fingers sure, but the performance was incomplete, not for lack of talent, but for lack of recognition. Because a griot doesn't only need a stage, they need a response. Imagine trying to recite a lineage to an audience who cannot tell a grandfather from a proverb. Imagine pouring your voice out, shaped by years of silence and ceremony, and seeing it vanish into brochure folding hands. Still, the griot returns. Again and again. To London. To Chicago. To Berlin. Not for applause, not for paycheck, but because someone must carry the names, even into rooms that do not know how to receive them. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone in that audience listens closely enough to feel it. A student scribbles a note. A musician hears a pattern. A child hums the melody all the way home. And the memory catches. Not much, not enough, but something. One griot in New York was asked, "Do you mind that we don't understand your words?" He smiled and said, "It is not your job to understand. It is your job to remember that I said them." You pause in your own remembering now, the notebook soft against your lap, and write. The griot performed beneath chandeliers and fluorescents. Not for kings, but for strangers. He carried his memory across oceans, knowing it would not land intact. He sang to chairs. He praised in translation. His voice met silence. But still he spoke. Because memory, to be memory, must be said aloud. Even when it falls into stillness. You lift your eyes again, not to the stage, but to the quiet still held within your chest. And realize that the griot's voice didn't vanish. It just shifted. And here, in this moment, you are its audience. The shadows have changed again. They stretch longer now, softer, drawing lines across the courtyard like someone trying to underline the end of a story. Though the griot, of course, never speaks in endings. The air is calm, the village quiet again, and the griot sits in a low chair, back straight, a bowl of something cool in hand. And for the first time all day, the voice you've been following doesn't come from his mouth, but from a small device beside him. A plastic speaker, a battered tape recorder, or maybe a mobile phone. Because today, the griot's voice is not bound to breath alone. Today, the griot enters the age of recordings. Here's your grounded historical fact. Starting in the mid-20th century, griots began to be recorded on cassette tapes, radio broadcasts, vinyl LPs, and eventually digital formats, creating new ways to preserve their performances, but also transforming the nature of what it meant to remember. Memory no longer needed to be carried in the body alone. It could be pressed, rewound, uploaded. You might think this was a welcome change, a relief, and in some ways, it was. Voices that once faded with the wind now lived in plastic shells and humming circuits. Entire epics could be archived. Whole lineages, once entrusted to a single living griot, could be shared across generations with the push of a button. But the change wasn't simple. Because when a griot is recorded, the rhythm cannot adjust to the listener. The joke cannot land differently depending on who laughs. The pace cannot slow for an elder who has just arrived late, or speed up for a child slipping into sleep. Memory, once fluid and alive, becomes locked in time. A performance frozen. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griots refused to be recorded unless the session included ritual elements, such as libations, naming of ancestors, or offerings of kola nuts, to ensure the act of capturing memory did not disrespect the spirits involved. For them, pressing record wasn't a technical act, it was a spiritual transaction. Which leads us to today's scholarly debate. Does recording griot performance preserve a tradition, or fracture it into fragments removed from its ritual and communal context? Some archivists celebrate the tapes as lifelines, proof that the voices existed, that they mattered. Others argue that the very nature of griot memory requires presence, responsiveness, change. And a recording, by definition, cannot change. You sit now beside the griot as he plays a tape of his father's voice, clear, worn with age, but steady. The words echo through the courtyard. And something odd happens. The griot responds to the voice aloud. He answers it, jokes with it, nods in rhythm. Because for him, the recording is not just sound. It is a living conversation. You realize, then, that griots never saw technology as an enemy. They saw it as an instrument. A new drum, A different kind of string. In the 1980s, griots began recording albums, some in studios, some beneath mango trees, with chickens clucking in the background. One griot layered traditional kora over electric bass. Another recited the lineage of a market chief onto a cassette that was played in taxis from Bamako to Ouagadougou. The voice traveled farther than any griot's feet could. And later, when mobile phones arrived, young griots recorded themselves on WhatsApp, sending praise songs to cousins abroad. Memory crossed borders now. It buzzed in pockets, arrived on screens, hummed through earbuds. The griot no longer needed to stand in front of you to speak your name. They could speak it across oceans. You take a moment now to write, your fingers ink-stained and sun-warmed. The griot pressed record, not to end memory, but to extend it. Their voice, once bound to breath and moment, now lived in circuits and signal. But it still carried weight, still spoke names, still remembered. A song caught in tape is not a loss. It is a trail, one you can follow home. You close your eyes, hearing the griot's father on the speaker, naming ancestors as though they were sitting beside him still. You don't know the language, but you feel it, like music you forgot you loved. And in the stillness that follows, you understand. The recording does not replace the griot. It becomes their echo. The day has grown tired now, stretched thin across the rooftops, its golden light beginning to pool in puddles of shadow. There's a breeze again, just the hint of one, carrying with it the smell of roasted maize and wood smoke, and something more intangible, like the breath of an old story just waiting to be told again. You sit where you've sat all day, but now the ground feels warmer, the space softer, as if everything has grown used to your presence. The griot is still nearby, though not speaking now. Not because the stories are done, but because the next one isn't his to tell. Because now you hear from the next generation. Here's your grounded historical fact. In modern West Africa, griot traditions are being actively inherited, reinterpreted, and revived by younger generations who blend ancient oral practices with new mediums, music, film, literature, and digital storytelling. These are not passive descendants. They are translators, experimenters, keepers who refuse to choose between old and new. You imagine one now. A young woman, no older than 25, seated on a mat beside her grandmother, who once recited lineages in palaces. The granddaughter wears jeans, her hair wrapped in a scarf the color of sunrise, and in her hand is not a drum, not a kora, but a phone. She scrolls through voice memos, each file named for an ancestor. One by one, she plays them back, praise songs, cautionary tales, birth recitations spoken in her grandmother's grainy voice. She nods, mouthing along, as if rehearsing for a performance yet to come. Because it is. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some young griots are now composing entire lineages as podcasts, TikTok serials, and Instagram captions. Each post a digital bead in a string of memory, rethreaded for a new audience. They remix kora riffs into hip-hop beats. They quote proverbs over lo-fi samples. They livestream naming ceremonies. It's not a dilution. It's a translation. And the story continues. This brings us to today's scholarly tension. Does modernization threaten the continuity of griot memory, or ensure its survival in the face of cultural erosion? One camp worries that the shift toward digital expression sacrifices nuance, rhythm, intimacy. Another sees it as an inevitable and necessary evolution, an echo chamber made wider, more durable. What's clear is that the griot has not disappeared. They've just changed microphones. You hear it now. A rap verse in Bambara, listing 8 generations in 2.5 minutes, each ancestor tied to a proverb, a rhythm, a string of pride that pulses beneath bass and snare. The crowd nods. They don't know every name, but they know why the names matter. And when the song ends, Someone in the back whispers, "That's my cousin's uncle he mentioned." You smile. Because that's the whole point. Younger griots don't claim to replace their elders. They carry them forward. Some still learn the old way, by sitting in courtyards, repeating verses, memorizing names until they thrum beneath their skin. Others learn by watching YouTube videos of griots long past, rewinding until they catch the syllable that always trips them up. Tradition, in their hands, is not an object. It's a current. One young griot began her TED talk with a line in Wolof, then translated it for the audience. "My name is not mine alone," she said. "It was spoken before me. It will be sung after me." She wasn't wearing ceremonial robes. She was wearing Converse and a beaded necklace shaped like a kora. And she spoke the names of her mother's mother's mother with the same rhythm her grandmother once used when grinding millet. You write now, carefully, reverently. The griot does not age out. They ripple forward. Their breath becomes playlist. Their rhythm becomes waveform. The memory does not shrink, it expands. Through cables, through screens, through voices pitched high over headsets in Accra, in Paris, in Oakland. The griot speaks, still, and the world, now, is just a little more ready to listen. You close your notebook softly. Not from fatigue, from awe. Because this isn't nostalgia, it's renewal. And somewhere just beyond this courtyard, a young voice clears its throat. Ready. The sun has begun its descent, not falling, but drifting. A long exhale of light across the village walls, stretching golden limbs through narrow alleys and between the slats of shaded verandas. The world, for a moment, seems suspended. Still moving, yes, but slowly. Softly, as if even time itself is listening. The griot has not spoken in some time, but the pause is not an absence. It's a waiting, a breath drawn before the final name is said. Because what comes next is not a song, nor a lineage, nor a performance. It's a return. Today, the griot brings the memory home. Here's your grounded historical fact. In many West African communities today, griots continue to serve as the custodians of family history, not only in ceremonial roles, but in quiet, private acts of remembering passed between generations in households and informal gatherings. The loudness of festivals may fade. The call to perform in public may lessen. But in kitchens, on woven mats, beside sleeping children, the griot still speaks. You imagine it now. A quiet evening in a family compound. Smoke rising from the last embers of dinner. The scent of cloves in the air. A grandfather, tired, eyes soft, sits with his youngest grandson beside him. No instruments, no crowd, just two people and a story passed between them like a bowl of warm porridge. The child doesn't understand every word, but he listens, and the griot knows that's enough. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some griot families keep personal memory books, not diaries, but notebooks filled with ancestor names, epithets, and family proverbs, used not for publication, but as private guides when the oral thread weakens. These are not substitutes for storytelling. They're tools, anchors, clues to help keep the memory from drifting too far. One griot called his book, "A Song Waiting to be Sung Again." And that brings us to today's scholarly question, one less debated in journals and more whispered in homes. How do you know when a memory is ready to be told? Is it when a child asks? When an elder forgets? When the air feels heavy with something unsaid? There's no rule, only instinct, only rhythm. A griot once said, "You do not choose the memory. The memory chooses the moment." You see it now in the subtle rituals. The father who, during dinner, casually names the grandfather who built the house. The mother who tells her daughter, "You walk like your aunt when she was young, fierce like a storm under silk." These aren't stories for stage or celebration. They're story seeds, sown gently in the soil of the everyday. And that is griot work, too. And so, in many ways, the griot does not vanish with age or fade with modernity. They simply return to the places where memory matters most: the family courtyard, the kitchen stool, the foot of a child's bed. The performance becomes quieter, but no less sharp, no less vital. One griot, long retired from public recitation, was asked if he missed the stage. He said, "The last audience is the one I was always singing for. My daughter, my son, the ones who will bury me, and still remember how I pronounced my father's name." That, he said, was enough. You take your pen again, slowly now, and write. The griot returned not to rest, but to root. Their voice, once loud enough to echo through kingdoms, now murmurs beside cooking pots and beneath mosquito nets. They sing no less. They simply sing closer. Memory, when shared in whispers, sinks deeper. And the home becomes the archive. The fire becomes the library. The name, once spoken, becomes the inheritance. You sit with those words for a long time. You don't move. Because the griot is not done yet. Not quite. The courtyard is quiet. The light has gone soft. And just beneath the hush, you hear it again, faint, familiar. A breath. A name. A homecoming. The sun is nearly gone now, slipping behind the hills with the elegance of something that's done this many, many times before. The sky glows in low amber and violet, a watercolor bleeding slowly toward dusk. The village has softened into its evening rhythm, pots scrubbed clean, mats unrolled, a rooster finally deciding he's earned his rest. And you're still there, still beneath the fig tree, still listening, because this is the last step in the long remembering. Not the end, just the part where the voice quiets. Tonight, the griot tells no more names. Tonight, the griot sings the self. Here's your grounded historical fact. In many griot traditions, a griot's final act before death was to speak, sing, or pass down their own lineage and story, either to a chosen apprentice, a family member, or the heir itself. This wasn't vanity, it was duty. You must name yourself last, so that your memory, too, can be held. You picture the moment now. A griot, old and thin as a walking stick, seated on a mat that smells of cedar and age. Around him, no crowd, just a nephew, a cousin, perhaps a grandchild who still fumbles the rhythm. The griot's voice cracks in places. He forgets a line, then laughs and corrects himself. He adds a small boast, leaves out a certain year, but then he names his mother, and the name lands like a stone on water, soft, heavy, final, and then he says his own. Not loudly, not as a declaration, just as truth. Here's your fringe tidbit. In some regions, a griot's kora or balafon was unstrung upon their death, or buried with them, so that their instrument would never sing another story. The silence, in that case, was not loss, it was respect. The voice had returned to the place from which it came. And so we arrive at our final scholarly meditation. Is the griot's role complete once they can no longer perform? Or does the memory they leave behind continue to ripple, sustaining their presence through the very act of being remembered? The answer, as always, is both. The griot stops speaking, but the story never does. You sit with this for a long moment. Not in grief, in awe. Because to remember oneself aloud, surrounded by those who carry your memory forward, is not a death. It is a final performance. A coda. A soft breath that says, you may go on without me. But not without what I've carried. You look across the courtyard now. A child runs past, giggling. A pot bubbles gently on a low fire. And someone in a neighboring room softly hums a line you've heard before. Not all griots leave with grand ceremonies. Some leave with a whisper. Some leave a notebook on a shelf. Some leave behind only the habit of being remembered. And so, at last, you write your final line. The griot named themselves not to boast, but to be passed on. Their final song was not about kings or wars, but about the long road between breath and silence. In that road, they left markers, notes, footsteps, names, and now, the memory walks on. In you. You rest your pen. The air cools. The night arrives with grace. And just before it all goes still, you think you hear it, faint, beneath the hush. We remember. Wind down, 300 words. So now, the fire has gone low, and the fig tree no longer casts shadow. The world is wrapped in blue, in hush, in that gentle descent we call night. You lie back fully now, eyes soft, chest steady, listening not to a voice, but to the absence it leaves behind. A good absence, a quiet one, the kind that means something has been completed, but not closed. You've walked far tonight, across centuries, into memory shaped by rhythm, by dust, by praise and repetition. You've heard names that belonged to kings and names that belonged to the woman who sold millet in the third stall on the left. All of them mattered, all of them were sung, all of them were remembered. And you? You've listened. That's enough. Maybe you won't recall every name. Maybe you'll forget a title, a cousin, a proverb that felt important. That's all right, because the memory lives not just in the details. It lives in the act of being held. Let it settle now. Let the breath go soft. Let your thoughts blur, your eyes drift, your body begin its slow surrender to sleep. The griot's voice has quieted, but the memory hums beneath your ribs. That small, steady beat of you are part of this. Of all this. And as you drift deeper, know this. You are remembered. You are enough. And now, sleep.